put on my glasses. Some of you I just had the chance to see at a reunion kickoff, so thank you for taking a little break and then coming to join us for our 8 o'clock presentation, which I know you will really enjoy. So for those of you I don't know, I am Rachel Nelson Moeller. I am a member of the class of 1988. I'm also the parent of a recently graduated Lafayette, I guess she's an alumna now, class of 2021. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's presentation, A Shot in the Arm, COVID Vaccines, and Our Slow Climb Out of the Pandemic Pit with Dr. Glenn Rall, class of 85. And that is part of our week-long virtual reunion celebration, of which, you know, you've gotten oodles of emails about, and hopefully this is just the beginning of all the sessions that you'll be joining for this week. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to just go over a couple of housekeeping things, although I know everyone is really quite familiar with Zoom at this point. But we have utilized the audience mute feature just to make sure that the presentation isn't interrupted by any background noise, dogs, pots, pans, the kinds of things, again, we're all used to hearing on Zoom. We do invite you to include your full name and class year in your profile if you'd like to do that. You can do this by clicking on the 3 dots in the upper right corner of your video on the gallery screen and select rename, and then you can type in your name as you'd like it to appear. If you're not familiar with Zoom, there are some different views. In the top right corner of your screen, for those of you on a computer, you can choose gallery view to see everyone, or you can choose speaker view to see the person speaking, which is what we recommend for the presentation portion. So we do welcome questions, and we ask that you use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions or comments that you might have. You can type in your questions at any time, but we probably will address them at the end of the prepared remarks. We've recorded the presentation. I think what else I had to say to you. We are recording this presentation so that you and the rest of the Lafayette community will have access to it later. So if you know folks who couldn't attend tonight, they will be able to view the recording. And if you are playing along with our game in the Socio app, and you're trying to earn points for prizes, the passcode for this session is vaccine, VACCINE. So that is my housekeeping. Now I would like to introduce, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Glenn Rall, who I know many of you on tonight's presentation know personally. He is a member of Lafayette's class of 1985. He is professor and chief academic officer at the Fox Chase Cancer Center in Philadelphia, and Dean of Faculty Affairs at Temple University's Lewis Katz School of Medicine. Glenn received his PhD from Vanderbilt University and completed postdoctoral training at the Scripps Research Institute. There's lots more to know about Glenn, but I know he is going to weave that into his presentation. So Glenn, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So let me go ahead and share my screen and make sure all of you guys are able to see this. Now let me go to this. All right. So I presume that you can hear me and that you can see me. Just give me a thumbs up so I can see that we're in good shape. All right, I see a couple. So I think we're fine. So I've actually changed the title of this talk a little bit. Don't fret. It still is about coronavirus and vaccines and the pandemic. But when I put in the title for this talk, we were very much in the stage of early vaccinations. And now we're at a point where probably if you wanted to be vaccinated, you already have been vaccinated. And so I've spent some time, I'm a bit of a melancholy reflective fellow. So I've spent some time thinking about what I've learned this past year as a virologist and as a scientist. And I think that I hope it's not self-serving. I hope that in my walking through some of those things, you'll find this instructive and informative, maybe a little thought-provoking, and maybe fodder for a conversation that we can have toward the end. So the slides will occupy, I don't know, 35 minutes, 40 minutes or so of my hour with you. And then we can spend the last 10, 15 minutes chatting, disagreeing, agreeing, however you wish. So I should note, let's see here, hang on a second. I should note that this talk does come with a warning. The warning is that I promise I will not be political in any way, but this talk is very pro-vaccine. So if you just don't want to hear it, then maybe I'm not for you. And maybe it's time to watch, I don't know, Matlock or something. But I promise that if you hang in there with me, even if you're not necessarily pro-vaccine, there still may be things to hold on to and things that you might find instructive. I warn you also in advance that it is filled with overly sentimental anecdotes and likely cloying metaphors. So I will apologize only once for them, and then I'm going to let them loose on you. But what this will be is a pretty accurate summary of my personal progress in the past 12 to 15 months. And even though I recognize I'm including my Lafayette years here in this statement, it has been the most educational year of my life. And so in some ways, the kinds of things that I've learned and seen are the things that I want to talk about and share with you. Okay, so Rachel already did a really nice job. So let me quickly get through this. The reason why I'm going to introduce myself is not, I hope I don't come across in any way sounding arrogant about it, but I think whenever you listen to information on any science topic, I think it's important to consider the source and what their credentials are. Because just because somebody might have a PhD or somebody might claim to be a scientist doesn't mean that every word that comes out of their mouth is legitimate. You surely don't want to hear me opine on, I don't know, botany or, you know, classical music. So by virtue of that, and Rachel already talked about some of this stuff. I graduated from Lafayette. My heavens, I had a great time. I'm glad to see some of my friends on this call. That's lovely. Graduated in '85, did my PhD at Vanderbilt in Nashville. Then I did my postdoctoral training at Scripps. I've been at Fox Chase since 1995. I have a variety of administrative jobs and I teach lots of different places. My laboratory studies, and has for 27 years, studies virus infections specifically that occur in the central nervous system, in the brain, and immune responses to those infections. Apropos of tonight's topic, I am one of two of the co-chairs of Fox Chase Cancer Center, where I am. Fox Chase's COVID response team. The other is a guy named James Hellstrom, who, if I have time, I will talk about later in the talk. So he and I, along with a phalanx of 50, 70 people, nurses and environmental services people, have helped to keep Fox Chase COVID-free, which is throughout these 14 months, a thing about which I'm pretty proud. I also happen to be the co-author of a textbook called Principles of Virology. There it is. I'm showing this to you in part because it is 200 days till Christmas, and what better gift to your child or to yourself than this text. Actually, I would not recommend you buy this text. It's fairly detailed and complex. I'm simply showing you this because some of my figures come out of the textbook, and I'm not going to acknowledge it every single time it comes out of the text. But the text was actually, that process of writing it was extraordinarily instructive for me because I kind of know one little corner of my field. And whenever you write a text, it forces you to be encyclopedic and kind of think about the whole gamish. So it's been very instructive as we've walked our way through the last 14 months of nightmare. Oh, and there's my email address. I think I put it at the end. You are more than welcome to send me emails. I write back, give me a little bit of time, maybe 24 or 48 hours, but I'm more than happy if after this you want to have another conversation or continue it, or you have questions, I'm more than happy to stay engaged with you on this. So how are we going to spend the next 40 minutes? So first, we're going to do a quick COVID check-in. We're going to do a temperature check of where we are today, literally today in the pandemic. I'm then going to set the record straight on herd immunity and resolve, at least for those of you who are on this call, a frustration that makes me a little bit wacky every single time I hear it. So we're going to try and talk about herd immunity, what it is and isn't. We're going to talk a little bit about the variants, because this certainly seems to be a thing people care a lot about. And I will explain to you in hopefully calming terms why I'm not particularly freaked out about the variants. And then we'll hit the 5 things, and we'll kind of do them in rapid succession, and then we'll be done. So where are we in the pandemic? Well, to start with a sort of threatening statement, just because things are getting better for you doesn't mean that they're getting better for everyone. So these are the rates of the United States daily rates of COVID infections. And I'll go ahead and put this up too. This is the daily rates of deaths. Of course, the scales here are notably different. I do want to point out that it was this period of time where all of us were completely freaking out. You could hear doors slamming shut. People were going to the grocery store at 3 o'clock in the morning. Everybody was bleaching their green beans. It was a terrifying time. And back then, we had no idea what lay ahead of us, right? And each of the little spikes that's here actually corresponds with holidays. It's an absolutely fascinating curve. Here is, sorry, my pointer is a little wacky. Here's the 4th of July. Here's Thanksgiving, here's Christmas, here's New Year's. So every time that people gathered together in groups, every time we mixed individuals from different pods or from different herds, as it were, as I'll talk about in a moment, bad things occurred. And the worst of it, of course, as you, I'm sure we're aware, was in the winter time, where despair, I think, was a reasonable feeling to have. This was a remarkably scary, awful time in that December, January, February period. Things have certainly gotten appreciably better. And in general, although we'll talk about this later, deaths have tracked with infections. While things have gotten better, and they will continue to get better, I promise you this is going to be a lovely semi-normal summer for you. I think it's important to acknowledge not just the loss of life, which alone would be worthy of comment, but 1 out of every 3, it's estimated, Americans are grieving the loss of someone from COVID. We have long haulers, individuals that continue to have symptoms or continue to test positive for months after the initial infection. Some individuals that have had a particularly rough bout with COVID have chronic lung issues. All of us have had mental health challenges, whether we're dealing with loneliness or boredom or confusion or despair or self-doubt, but people with mental health conditions that pre-existed before COVID have even had a tougher time of this. And of course, the economic ramifications have been vast. I include here a picture. This is a fairly mediocre bar near Fox Chase where I work. It's called Hop Angel Brow House. You'd go there because the beers are good. You surely would not go there for the food. I put this up not actually as a joke. It was the first time I realized that this pandemic was going to have permanent consequences, because it was the first business that I knew of pretty well that closed permanently. And since then, of course, in your neighborhoods as well as in mine, restaurants, stores, shops that are beloved have closed. And I hope all of those folks that either were employed by them or who own those stores are going to end up okay at the end of this. But the ramifications of this are going to long outlast the pandemic itself. Why are the rates getting better? Well, the rates are getting better, of course, because of these vaccines. As of today, so actually, sorry, June 4th is when I collected this, at least 171 million Americans have received 1 or both doses of the vaccine. This is approximately 51% of all Americans, but I want to make a point how diverse our country is. So this is a scale in which the lighter green colors are less than 40%. The darker green colors are 55, 56, 60%. And you'll notice that if you live anywhere near Lafayette, I live right around here and near Philadelphia, we live in a very dark green part of the country, and that's gratifying. But you can note that other parts of the country, including the South, parts of the Midwest, are very, very variable. And of course, viruses don't obey or abide by state barriers. You can travel freely from state to state. And so we are only as good as a country as our least vaccinated population. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the United States actually has an abundance of these vaccines. Of course, it makes sense that we're going to buy up as much as we possibly can. That just feels consistent with the US's sort of mojo. So the United States has 16% of the world's population, and we have purchased 53% of the vaccine doses. We have enough doses to vaccinate every human in the United States 3 times over. I am heartened to know that some of the spare vaccines are not just going to decay in freezers, but that we have chosen to start giving these out to countries that otherwise cannot afford them. But nevertheless, we are richly blessed with having vaccines available for those that want access to them. This is very different than the rest of the world. So here is a temperature check of where the world is. And these are daily reported cases on the left and deaths on the right. And the contrast, I hope, is stark for you, because while our country is heading deeply down to the baseline here, other parts of the world have higher averages than they've had at any point before in the pandemic. Now, I will say this was taken on May 10th. These rates have continued to decline, and we're hopeful that they'll decline even further. But at least as of a month ago, the worst part of this pandemic was not behind us. We were in the midst of it if we think of ourselves as citizens of the world. And today, the worst parts of the world in terms of where the pandemic rages and corresponds with a huge amount of individuals dying of this infection are in places like sub-Saharan Africa, India, South America countries, including Brazil and Argentina, and variably countries in Europe, such as Italy and Turkey and others. There are huge vaccination distribution disparities among countries based on wealth. So here we're looking at the proportion of individuals that have been vaccinated along this x-axis. The size of the dot indicates the size of the country, and green countries are high income, and the tanner colors are low income countries. So this is the United Arab Emirates over here. Here's Israel, Great Britain, the United States, China, India. And the point to make is that all the green countries, predictably perhaps, the high income countries, are extraordinarily well vaccinated and have abundant supplies, and yet the rest of the world, lower income countries or moderate income countries, are still struggling. There are countries that have, remember, we're over 51% of us are vaccinated. There are countries that have 1 or 2% of their population that have been afforded an opportunity to have a vaccine. So this leads into my little conversation with you about herd immunity, because I think we misunderstand, and the phrase is kind of thrown around a little sloppily, in my opinion. So let me give you Glenn's view of what herd immunity is about. So this phrase makes me nuts. When we reach herd immunity, in quotes, as if it's like ringing a bell at a carnival, that one day you're going to wake up and on the news, they're going to be like, we've finally reached 73.7% of the population, the pandemic is over, and we can all flood the streets and hug. It is not like that, right? No one, first of all, knows what the magic percent might be. That's why you often will hear quotes that say somewhere between 70 and 85%, and even that's an estimate. I will say as a positive, that every individual that gets vaccinated gets us one step closer to ending this pandemic. So on the good thing here is even if you don't ring the bell, as it were, every person that gets vaccinated is one more person that comes out of the vulnerable population that could potentially be infected. So every individual act is not only an act to protect yourself, but it's an act to prevent infection within your community. The emergency use authorization that came out last month that allowed children 12 to 15 years of age to get the Pfizer vaccine is going to go a long way to curtailing infections. And my prediction would be, although I don't, by the way, work for any vaccine companies, I don't make any money on these vaccines, so you may agree or disagree with my points, but it certainly is not that anything I say is of personal benefit to me. But my guess would be that vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, perhaps others, will be made available to all individuals, regardless of age. That includes neonates, by late summer, early fall. I have a feeling that this coming fall is going to look like a very normal school year, especially if we can get kids access to the vaccines. But what's most important for me to try and convey to you is that herd immunity is a scientific concept more than a value to achieve. So where did it come from? Well, it's called herd immunity because it all had to do initially with herds, like herds of cows. There's one on the left. So, and there's a bunch of cows represented by individual blue dots on the right. So a herd is defined by an isolated group of individuals, right? So all those herds live on a farm, I guess, all those cows live on a farm. They're all surrounded by a fence, I suppose, but they all are part of one community. The chances that those cows are going to get to meet cows that live down the road, you know, some exciting Saturday night is highly unlikely. So the idea of herd immunity is that if the majority of a population is vaccinated, or is otherwise protected against an infection, that forms a natural protection even for the couple of members that aren't infected, such that if, let's say, some cow from down the road happened to show up and breach into the show you how much I know about farms. Reach into the paddock, I don't know, into the barnyard. All of these vaccinated cows would be able to repel the infection and form, in a sense, an immunological wall around these couple of cows. Hence, herd immunity is protecting these guys, even though they did not get vaccinated. So why am I telling you this? Because it makes a huge difference when we think about us as humans. This policy, this rule goes out the window if now, let's say, the farm is overrun by a whole bunch of infected cows. At that point, for certain, any of the unvaccinated guys are going to become infected, for certain. So this raises the question, since we don't live in barns and are surrounded by fences, what's a herd of humans? And what does herd immunity mean when we talk about it pertinent to us? So local herds, you've got lots of them, right? Your family, your work, if you go to work, if you don't work from home, your friend group, maybe you're part of a religious association, stores you frequent, all of those are kind of considered local herds, and you move from one to the next with some frequency over the course of the week. And I would predict that over time, we're going to see little fires, little focal outbreaks that occur. But once worldwide travel begins, I would propose that a herd of humans is humanity. It's all of us. So even if you're not particularly worried about what's happening in Europe or Southeast Asia, you probably should be, because once worldwide travel reinitiates, now what we're doing is mixing, let's say, groups of people, perhaps the United States, that's highly protected, 90% or so protected, perhaps by the time we get to that point, with a group that might be at a lower level of protection. And what this means is that in isolation, the 10% of individuals in this population are pretty well protected. But when we begin to mix these populations, like the analogy I used before, it's almost certain that this 10% of individuals is now going to be vulnerable. And this matters because worldwide travel has been the greatest way of transmitting infections and mixing populations over vast distances. It's one of the reasons why this pandemic is so notably different from the 1918 flu pandemic, which we can talk about during the question session. My final little sciencey speech before we get to the 5 things I've learned is a little bit about variance. So my apologies for a wee bit of science on this one, but I hope that this is going to be somewhat comforting for you. There is a concept in evolution called Mueller's ratchet. And hopefully you can see that if I turn this ratchet in a counterclockwise direction, that's the only way that it can go, because it can't reverse, right? There's no way that this thing can go in a clockwise direction. And this concept underscores evolution in asexual entities, that is, ones in which genetics don't mix the way they do for, let's say, us as humans or for other mammals. So in asexual entities, like viruses, mutations occur and they accumulate at every replication cycle. And these mutations cannot be removed, and most of them make that, let's say, virus less capable of growing. Right? Every mutation is sort of an error, you could think of it that way, and therefore it gets weaker and less effective. And generally speaking, they fall out of the population because they're less competitive than their nearest neighbors that didn't mutate. But on rare occasions, some mutations will actually improve the ability of a virus to replicate. And when that happens, they'll quickly predominate within a population. And this is what we're seeing with the variants now that initially had complex names like B117 and I think 253.5, and then had, unfortunately, names that linked them to their sites of origin within the world, which I'm glad went away. And now we're just referring to them as alpha, beta, gamma, delta, far easier nomenclature. And people are very anxious about these because you've been vaccinated, if you've gotten vaccinated, if you received one of the COVID vaccines, against what we refer to as the parental strain. So let's just say, here's a little bit of biology, don't fret, my fellow Lafayette grads, you'll be fine. If this is just a protein that consists of a whole bunch of amino acids, doesn't matter what they are, these epitopes are things that antibodies will recognize. Antibodies recognize little sections of an individual protein. And a protein, the spike protein, for example, for SARS, has 20 of these little sites, 20 different places that different antibodies can bind and recognize that will help to neutralize the infection. So if, let's say, after the first round of replication of this virus, you introduce a mutation here colored in black and a mutation here and a mutation here, well, that seems concerning because I might have knocked out 2 of the potential ways that antibodies can bind. So in this virus, I still have epitope 2, 4, and 5 available, but I've knocked out epitope 1 and 3. And the big concern, because these mutations don't go away, the Mueller's ratchet, once the mutation is in, it stays in, they will continue to accumulate mutations. And the big worry that I don't think is a worry is that we might end up with this virus down here, a virus that has got mutations that knock out every single one of the ways in which the neutralizing antibodies that you generated following vaccination would be able to vanquish an infection. The reason I'm not worried about this is because look at how heavily mutated this protein would be. Viral proteins do things. For the spike protein, it is the key that allows coronavirus to get inside your cells and initiate an infection. So it seems extraordinarily implausible to me that you would evolve a variant that has knocked out every single one of the epitopes that neutralizing antibodies can recognize and still be functional. It is almost a certainty that this protein, this guy down here at the bottom, will be dysfunctional and will not, in fact, contribute to a substantial part of the population. The variants that are in circulation now knock out 1 or a couple of these epitopes, right? And remember, as I told you, there's an estimated 20 plus or minus T cell and neutralizing antibody epitopes on the spike protein. So in order to have a virus, a variant that was truly invisible to the vaccine, you'd have to knock out all 20 of them. Seems like an impossibility to me. And moreover, I should note that the RNA vaccines in which you can plop in the RNA into the nanoparticles, this is what boosters and that technology were made for. So if we have to get boosters, and I suspect we might, probably the beginning of next year, it might be, instead of being the parental spike, it might be whatever the variant that's circulating within the United States most prevalently is. It would be very straightforward to make that viral vaccine were that to be the case. So I hope that made sense. That was as intense as the science is going to get. But I hope it also allayed some concerns, because there's a lot of people who, in good faith, got the vaccine and then sort of got anxious that that vaccine would not function against the variants. We can talk about it more in the questions, but I'm fairly confident that's not going to be an issue going forward. All right, here they come, the 5 things. So here we are at a point where you can walk into any CVS and get a vaccine, and yet there still is a high proportion, as I showed you in the US map, of Americans that have chosen not to get vaccines, maybe some of you. So one thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is how we as humans make decisions. And I think I've come to the conclusion, and don't worry, I'll be self-disparaging, I promise, in just a moment, and not judgy, that we overemphasize unlikely outcomes. So let me give you an example. If I said to you, and we're just going to do a thought experiment here, but if I said, tell me anything you know about SARS CoV-2, anything at all, you might tell me that it's spread by aerosol. You might tell me that it's a respiratory infection. You might say that it's killed millions of people across the world, or you might say that rates are declining in your neighborhood. Any of those things would be perfectly fine. If I told you, tell me something you know about the J&J vaccine, I suspect a high proportion of you might mention blood clots. I have a feeling that that might be true. And if we actually take a look at how often blood clots occurred with the J&J vaccine, out of over 8 million people who've been vaccinated with the J&J vaccine, 15 of them have gotten blood clots. But 7.999 million individuals were successfully vaccinated. And so the rhetoric about the J&J vaccine is all about blood clots, when in fact, the vast majority of individuals, the vast majority of individuals benefited from protection. But you know what is also true? Blood clots due to COVID infections or SARS CoV-2 infections, depending on the severity, are somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% of infected individuals. So while you might not mention blood clots as being something you know about SARS CoV-2, it is a far more frequent, far more prevalent, far more dangerous consequence than getting the J&J vaccine. And so this is what I mean by overemphasizing or overexploiting unlikely outcomes. And this leads to my Senor Salsa story. Remember, I told you I had dumb analogies, so you have to suffer through this. I don't know if any of you live anywhere near Philadelphia or Elkins Park, which is where I live. There is a restaurant called Senor Salsa. It's a Mexican restaurant up on 611, a fairly busy road. And right across the street from Senor Salsa is Abington Memorial Hospital, directly across the street. So here's my story. Here's my metaphor for you. If I work at Senor Salsa and I'm chopping up onions and I cut myself really badly, and now I'm standing on the street corner directly across 611, this busy, sort of 2-lane road from Abington Memorial Hospital, and you come out and you're like, Glenn, you might want to cross the street and get yourself taken care of because you're bleeding pretty profusely. And I said to you, well, no, I don't want to cross the street because I'm afraid I'm going to get hit by a car. You can't promise me that won't happen. Indeed, 611 is a pretty busy street. And so I'm choosing to worry about a thing that is a possibility, but I'm ignoring the bigger risk of not taking care of myself. And this is sort of how I think about individuals who are worried about, let's say, blood clots, or that the vaccine was accelerated too quickly. I can't promise you that you won't be one of those individuals that gets a blood clot from a J&J vaccine. Of course, I can't promise you that. But what I can do is talk to you about the odds and talk to you about the consequences if you choose not to get vaccinated and how much more of a risk you pose to your own well-being. So that's my Senor Salsa example. Maybe that was silly, or maybe it was a bit instructive. But I think when we think about how we provide protection to each other, it's not just about what risks we're trying to prevent, but what the converse is, what risks we're exposing ourselves to by not acting. Secondly, as part of this human decision-making is chaotic, I think we're conditioned to see patterns and trends. This was certainly true when people were concerned about the MMR vaccine and childhood autism. They said, well, the rate of autism in children is increasing dramatically. That is true. And they also said, and the number of vaccines that we're giving to kids is increasing. That is also true. And so they saw these two things as connected examples. You might look at this figure where I've taken off the labels and say, well, whatever is being measured in red and whatever is being measured in black must somehow be interconnected because they come up together, they go down together, they seem to phase together. And that is a very thoughtful, sentient opinion to have. Those two things look like they're connected until you realize that the red line is the number of letters in the winning word of the Scripps National Spelling Bee, and the black line is the number of people killed by venomous spiders. We as smart humans want to see trends even when those trends don't exist. So unless there's something nefarious about the spelling bee and spiders, there's no connection between these things, even though it overtly seems like there is a pattern or a trend that exists here. Third, for a lot of us, conspiracy stories are kind of juicy. They're fun to tell other people, and data, by and large, is kind of dull to look at. It's the challenge of science writers for newspapers and for magazines. And as a result, many news outlets are not particularly trustworthy. And I'm not just speaking of the fringe ones. I'm talking about something as sort of meat and potatoes as CNN, in which this story was published a few months ago, I think. Yeah, January 27th. It made me infuriated because it said CDC doesn't know if new COVID-19 variants are causing rare complication in children. A reader could be forgiven for walking away from that story thinking, oh my God, these variants, they cause this rare complication, which sounds terrifying in kids. Look at the article. It's a non-story. The CDC doesn't know. And indeed, there is no evidence, now that we know more about these variants, that there is, in fact, such a rare complication that occurs in kids. So even sometimes the news sources you trust can lead you astray because they're trying to propose something titillating to keep you reading as opposed to keeping you educated and informed. This is also combined with the fact that scientists change their mind all the time. This is actually an article from Wired, not one that I have a problem with at all, but it talks about how masks went from don't wear to must have. At the beginning of the pandemic, remember, you were told don't wear masks. And the reason for that was we were saving them for the healthcare workers because we didn't have enough of the supply. When the information changed, when the supply of PPE changed, the advice changed. But to a lot of people who aren't part of the decision-making or who don't kind of understand the cadence of science, it makes us as scientists seem fickle. And that contributes to a lack of trust or a lack of faith in our ability to provide actionable, useful guidance. Almost done with number one, I promise. And I think another thing that makes our decision-making chaotic is that we make decisions based on multiple inputs. So I'm going to tell you stories of two people. The first one is Amy. So this is actually from the Associated Press back in 2004. Amy was a member of a large Christian community in Texas, where there was a gigantic measles virus outbreak. And Amy was quoted in the AP to say, "To get a vaccine would have been viewed by me and my friends and my peers as an act of fear that you doubted that God would keep you safe, you doubted God would keep you healthy. We simply didn't do it." And I still feel sad that when I first started talking about this in lectures at Penn and other places, that I was kind of dismissive of Amy. I thought, oh, come on, there's a vaccine that's available for you. Like, get the vaccine, protect yourself, protect your kids. Until I remembered a story about another individual named Glenn. That's this guy here. So you may not tell from what you're looking at, but I'm a little on the chubby side. And I've been told by physicians, hey, Glenn, you might want to lose a couple pounds, a couple dozen pounds. But you know what also is true about Glenn is that he loves baked goods. And if this reunion were in person and one of you showed up with freshly baked, whatever it is, guess who's going to be front in line, right? And so even though I have been told by my healthcare providers, you might want to avoid tapping into, cookies or whatever else it is, I'm going to probably still do it. And the point I'm trying to make here, and please believe me, I'm not equating my love of pastries or baked goods with someone's faith. I'm simply saying that despite what we as scientists or we as communicators might believe to be true because of people's habits or religious beliefs or peer pressure or history or the values that you attribute to each of those things, you might still lose the argument. We make decisions about our own lives based upon many, many sources of input, as it were, of which science and medicine is just one. And I think being aware that that is part of the decision-making process that all humans, me included, end up making helps to make a little bit more sense of why sometimes folks will buck the advice that they were given by a physician or a scientist. All right, second thing I've learned is tolerance is a survival skill. So I promised that I would say yes to anyone who asks me questions from the very beginning of this pandemic. And so I am known for getting stopped in the hallway at Fox Chase and other places. At the beginning of the pandemic, the kinds of questions or the kinds of accusations that I got to hear about were only sheeple, that is, I guess, people who follow along with what other people tell them to do. Only sheep will wear masks, or this virus is no worse than the flu. In the middle of the pandemic, I got statements like, I'm young and healthy, I don't care if I get COVID. My favorite, the Joanne Fabrics one, where someone tells me, they say, do you have 2 minutes? And then they proceed to tell me about their sister that works with someone at Joanne Fabrics and her son's girlfriend that got a cough last Thursday. And you really need like a piece of paper to write this out and kind of figure out relationships among people. And now the questions I'm getting, at least up until recently, were about the vaccines themselves, that Trump rushed the vaccine to get reelected, that they're fearful that they're microchipping us, that there are baby parts in those vaccines. There are concerns about, will these vaccines affect my fertility? And the one that is the hardest to argue, because of course I cannot prove anything about the future, is can you prove this won't have some negative outcome in 10 years? No, of course I can't. What I can do is rely on what we know from vaccines in the past, and for which 0 of them have had any adverse consequences years in the future. In fact, fairly few of them have had adverse consequences. But it poses a challenge to your ability to be tolerant of individuals that come up with a wide mix of questions that seem designed to make you nuts. Moreover, the argument that asking people to wear masks or asking people to get vaccinated infringes on their rights strikes me just I was a philosophy minor at Lafayette, strikes me as being kind of poorly thought through and flimsy, right? So let's go back to 611, that busy road that I was telling you about, with Senor Salsa on one side and the hospital on the other side. Think about how much faith you put in other humans to respect the double yellow line, right? When you're going up or down a busy road, you're a foot away from cars that are constantly passing you in the opposite direction. And you have complete confidence, I hope, that the people who are on that road are going to abide by the same rule of staying on the right side of the yellow line, right? We all agreed to drive on the right side of the road, not just because it's a law, but because it's what keeps us all safe. And it doesn't strike me that it's an infringement on your right to drive on the left side of the road. So this argument that by doing things that contributes to the collective good, whether it's wearing a mask or getting a vaccine, is an imposition on your rights, it strikes me that when those begin to infringe on the rights of other people is when we actually have to have a bit of a disagreement and a conversation. So this whole thing has been about tolerance, right? And I'm not seeming particularly tolerant right now. But I think what I think is important to remember, however frustrating some of the questions or some of the conversations you might have with, I don't know, with your neighbors, with your family, with your partners, with your kids might be, we haven't all had a shared experience. And this is actually really important. So here are the curves for individual states: New York State, Alabama, and Michigan. And the thing I want to point out is how different things were at the beginning of this pandemic. If you lived in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or Washington State, what was happening outside your window was exactly what you were hearing about on the news. It was a terrifying time right around now, a year ago, right? Because people you knew were getting COVID. Perhaps people you knew were dying of COVID. But look what happened in Alabama. The whole country was told the pandemic is here, close your doors, close your businesses, close up shop. And in Alabama, they're looking out their window, they're seeing what we all saw on the news, but they're looking out the window and no one in their communities are getting infected. And so they're being asked to close down their businesses or to change their lives in a fundamental way, even though their perceived risk of infection was extraordinarily low, an entirely different experience in the Deep South and in the Midwest compared to ours in the Northeast. And I think this is really important. It's not about politics. I think a lot of people think it's about politics, but it's about how you went into this pandemic. We all have a healthy regard for it because here we are here, most of us, I presume. But notice that then, in the second phase, it catches up in the South. Michigan even then sort of thought, oh, look, the Midwest is going to be spared because, I don't know, we're the heartland, but eventually they got it too, right? So the point here is, before you make assumptions about why other people are doing what they do, recognize that we have not all had the same history, the same experience, living in different parts of the country, perhaps having different relationships with vaccines in our past, change our perception, right? And so my argument to you, or my contention to you, is the moment that you feel absolutely certain that you have the chorus of angels behind you and that you are right as rain might be the best time to check yourself. In my question slide, I put this picture up and I did not refer to it whatsoever. But I'll bet you that if I said to you, tell me how many red balls there are, with great confidence, you would tell me that there are 4. But you'd be wrong. This is an optical illusion. All of those balls are exactly the same color. And all that differs is the color of the lines that cross in front of them. So even though you would be absolutely certain, you would be wrong. And I think it's important to recognize before I get on my high horse and start pointing my finger or wagging my finger and lecturing to people, that I need to recognize that I might be incorrect about this and they might have a useful point. And this then leads to item number 3, or topic number 3, that more than ever, for us as scientists or healthcare professionals, we need to learn how to converse with non-scientists. I mean, think about what I'm doing right now. You're presumably sitting there quietly and you're letting me go on and lecture at, some length here for, an hour. This seems remarkable. This is not how humans communicate. And as scientists, if you don't get my point, guess what? I'm going to try it from a different angle. And if data convinces, then even more data convinces more. And this is not, in fact, how to have conversations with people about their worries about the pandemic or their worries about vaccines, or their worries about any other issues that pertain to their health. So this is what I've learned over time, because my initial reaction was, I mean, I lecture, it's what I sort of partly do for a living. So this opining for an hour in my own dining room, not being able to see any of you, no problem. I got this down. But what I've had to learn how to do is to have conversations with people that are true conversations. So I begin those conversations with empowerment by saying, look, this is not a law. If you don't want to get vaccinated, that is your decision and I respect it. And indeed I do. I can't tell you what to do, just like I would be really irritated if someone said, hey, put down that cookie, right? So I'm okay with this. And that changes right from jump the tone of the conversation, because now I'm not going to lecture them. Now we are meeting as equals because they are empowered. They are fine making whatever decision they want. But that does provide a little bit of an opening for me to ask some questions. So I listen. I try to respond with short declarative sentences, not blue book answers. I suspect some of my classmates remember blue books. They terrified the hell out of me. I would write as many words as possible in the hope that some of them were the right answer. Nobody wants a blue book answer for this. So if you have these conversations, don't get frustrated, don't lecture, don't dismiss what they say. My wife, Eileen, managed Fox Chase's vaccine clinic. She actually did that as a volunteer. And there were a couple of days that I worked in the vaccine clinic myself, just to be part of that experience. And there were a lot of folks that came up and I said, how are you today? And they said, well, I'm scared. And my immediate reaction, because I wanted to soothe their worry, was I said, there's nothing to be scared about. And my wife, who's a clinician, said, don't do that, because even though you're trying to calm them down, you're denying them the right to be scared. It's okay for them to be scared. Better to say, I know this can be scary. How can I help? It seems subtle. It may seem a little new agey, but man, it works. One of the best experiences I had was there was an older woman, a cancer patient, actually, who said, I'm scared. And so I said, I know this can be scary. How can I help? And she said, you can hold my hand while I get the vaccine. And so I went in with her and I held her hand and I talked to her about her grandkids. And sorry, I'm getting even a little emotional telling you about it. And the vaccine was in and out in no time, right? So those sorts of things are how we as preachy scientists can connect in a better way and recognize that you may not win, but that maybe if they're going to say, yeah, I heard what you said, doc, but I'm still not going to get my vaccine, who knows? Maybe you said something that 3 weeks from now is going to resonate with them, and you may have an impact even if it doesn't seem to be immediate for you. The fourth, and I'm going to skip over this because I want to be sure I save time for questions. So I can tell you about my visit to Jean's ICU with my buddy James Hellstrom if you really want to hear about it. But crises reveal. I'm certainly sad about the loss over the last year, and I don't want to minimize it in any way. But there have been true heroes that have emerged from this. So these are the daily cases in the United States, cases and deaths. I showed you this before, but I'm showing this now for a different reason. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were a relatively small number of cases, but look at the death rate. Of course, again, let me remind you, the scale is very different here, but extraordinarily large number of deaths here. And that perhaps is due to the fact that most of the individuals that got infected and died were the elderly, people who had pre-existing conditions or who were immunologically somewhat immunodeficient. But look where we are now. The rates are still higher now than where they were at the beginning, but the death rate has decreased substantially. And as I say, this is partly due to differences in the demographics of people who are infected. But it's also due to the fact that separate from the vaccines, which I guarantee you will be the biggest medical advance in any of our lifetimes, is also the fact that at the same time we've developed drugs and diagnostics and blood tests for those individuals that got the infection that help make their lives a better one now than earlier on in the pandemic. right? So the development of drugs like tocilizumab, for example, which is an interleukin-6 inhibitor that has actual real benefit for individuals that are having a hyperinflammatory response during the pandemic, or even just the awareness that ratios of blood cells called neutrophils and lymphocytes, that a poor or a high neutrophil lymphocyte ratio might predispose that individual to a rough outcome and therefore might warrant a little overzealous or extra attention. Those sorts of things have helped to make the lives of even those of us who've gotten COVID better. And that's science. That's due to scientists and physicians working around the clock to help make things better for all the rest of us, right? And there are other people as well. When I gave part of this talk as my faculty lecture, I actually cited a lot of the people who work at Fox Chase in environmental services or security or the nurses that helped to contribute. These are people that stepped forward when all the rest of us were stepping back. And so crises reveal for bad, but crises also reveal the best in us as well. And it's been a lovely counterpoint to see people stepping up that never asked to be put into this kind of position. All right, I'm almost done. So when can we get back to normal? And this is my fifth point. I think, I'm sorry to say, the normal that we knew is gone. We're not going to be going back to normal. We're not going to be going back to pre-COVID time. And that sounds scary, because I think all of us look back on what happened before as where we want it to be, right? Maybe we look back on our days at Lafayette as being some of the best in our life, and we tend to paint it as all positive when in fact it probably for all of us was a little bit mixed. The thing is that we are better now in many ways than we were before the pandemic, right? Remember Mueller's ratchet, you don't go backwards. Right? We have a deeper appreciation of the challenges that some people, especially young parents, have for balancing their personal lives with their professional lives. And I hope that we're a little bit more aware and considerate and generous and thoughtful when it comes to young parents who are trying to manage a career and also manage young children. We now realize that physically attending meetings that I could go to on Zoom seems to be absolutely prehistoric. It allows for parents who might be home with sick kids to still tune in to seminars or still have important meetings if they need to. For us as scientists, geekily enough, I'm sure that most meetings are going to be virtual and in person. So it gives you access to more science, even if you can't physically travel to where that meeting is happening. Telemedicine is going to be a revolutionary and here to stay new feature. It's not going to replace all of your doctor's visits, but it might reduce your need to have to go wait for 3 hours in a waiting room just to have a 10-minute conversation with your physician that you could do easily online when he or she gives you a call. And we have a sense of how to do this better moving forward. We have an awareness of what it takes to reduce influenza rates. And here I specifically mean influenza rates. Those rates have declined by 90%, 95% over the last year. And hopefully we're more prepared for the next pandemic. So my final slide. I've said this all along. I think back at the end of the year, I said, I think we're going to have a terrible winter, a hopeful spring, and a good summer. We certainly had a terrible winter. I think we're in the midst, at least I feel hopeful, maybe you do too, but it'll be a hopeful spring. And I suspect we're going to have a good summer as long as all of us continue to be respectful of each other and comply with sort of basic rules and policies. I suspect you're going to see localized spikes, and those might be a little bit scary, but I don't think we're going to ever go back to where we were in January, thankfully. And almost surely, yes, there will be boosters. I don't think they'll be for the rest of your days. I suspect you might need a booster, if I had to guess, at the end of the calendar year, beginning of 2022, maybe a year thereafter. And it's going to take a while before this virus is fully vanquished. But certainly, in terms of doing what you did before, going back to work, being able to see friends, have barbecues and parties and people over to your house, I suspect you can do that. And the last thing, and I'm sorry, because I know it seems a little preachy, but I included in every one of my talks, is if you can, make a difference, right? 20 years from now, your kids, your grandkids, whoever is going to say, did you live through the COVID pandemic? And you will say, yes, I did. And you want to be able to say, you know what? I also made a difference, even if it was just for a person. So what's that mean? Give blood if you can. Donate to a food bank. I used to advocate for people to volunteer at vaccine clinics because, man, they needed help. So use this as an opportunity, not just to be anxious and scared, but lean in. Because remember, crises reveal. So this is an opportunity for you to actually now get out there and be part of something good, so that when this is put behind us, you can look back on this time with some degree of pride. All right, that is my talk. I'm going to now stop screen sharing. I'm going to see if any of you have dozed off while I've been chatting. Let's see here. And if you've got questions, I realize it's 4 minutes before. I'm sorry I went a little bit long. I'm happy to stick around as long as you like, but I want to stop talking and see if you've got any comments or questions. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Glenn, so much. So if people have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat.
Or you can unmute. I'm happy to have a conversation. It's easier sometimes just to chat. There's only 30 of you or so, so I'm more than happy if you want to unmute.
So what I'll do is I need to give people permission to be able to unmute themselves. But let me ask you, I'll ask you a question while I'm doing that. Any word on, or the vaccines for the under 12-year-old set for children, and what, I'm sure we might have some parents of younger kids on the call.
Yep, I don't know the answer. I know that there are vaccine trials that have been opened up for younger kids for the Pfizer vaccine, as the Pfizer continues to push younger and younger with time. This is obviously crucial that we have volunteers who make sure that these vaccines are safe, but I don't think anyone is suspecting anything surprising from them. Remember, neonates, right? 3-month-old, 6 months old are brought to the pediatrician, and those poor little guys are getting measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio. So there's no reason to think that they won't have a beneficial reaction to COVID, but we have to make certain that we do the safety trials, right? We don't want to cut corners in places that matter. So that takes time. I suspect that they're going to break the code of the kids that have been either given placebo or the vaccine at some point later in the summer. So I think I mentioned that probably we're going to start seeing that age limit decrease by the end of the summer. That's my guess.
Great. So I'm looking in the chat. So I know Lenita had a question. If I can get the right. How can we do better to educate the lay public about the nature of science, in particular the fact that knowledge in pandemics evolves and we need to understand and be flexible, not critical and paralyzed? Actually,
the answer is in the question, right? I think a little bit of humility. Scientists, I work with a lot of them. I think, it feels good to know what you know. It feels gratifying to be able to say, I know this for a certainty. But there's a difference between knowing it and convincing someone else of it. And so exactly, Anita, if I'm remembering the name correctly, exactly how you framed it, to recognize that other people might have different opinions and that this might be an opportunity for a conversation rather than for a full-on lecture. But you're right that it's important. And actually, the general, not you guys, look, you're willing to spend an hour on a warm summer-ish evening listening to this. So surely this doesn't apply to you. But I think there are a lot of folks who are kind of science averse because they feel like they're going to come away from that conversation feeling demeaned or stupid or unaware or ignorant. So I think a lot of us have to recognize that it's an opportunity not to educate, but to have a conversation. And they might have useful input on the other side as well. If you don't go into it like you're teaching a class, that's probably a pretty good way to start.
And then Linda had a question. She said that you mentioned that boosters may contain a mutated version of the coronavirus used to create the current vaccine. So a timing question. If boosters are needed in December 2021, for instance, vaccine companies will make the booster how many months earlier, thereby containing a variant that may be several months old? And how long does it take to produce a booster?
It's a really good question, Linda. So Moderna the company, one of the two companies made the RNA vaccine. Maybe this is obvious to you, but the last three letters of Moderna are RNA. That company was in existence for over a decade before the pandemic. The intent of making vaccines that encode RNA was an intent to make the safest and most simple and quickest to market vaccines that we have. It's not an accident that Pfizer and Moderna were the first two out of the gate, followed then by ones like J&J and AstraZeneca and others. So it is very easy to make this. Moderna is a company that's been around for 10 years. Man, I wish I had stock in that company. They've been around for 10 years making the delivery vehicle, these sort of lipid nanoparticles. So it is pretty trivial to take an RNA molecule and mix it with the lipid moieties that are then part of the vaccine. So I think it will not take a long time to, if we have, let's say, a new variant Omega that happens to be circulating, it'll be pretty straightforward to be able to take that spike, the Omega spike, and put that into booster vaccines, just to make certain that you are protected, not just against the parental, but also against the variants. Should be pretty straightforward.
And I'll insert this, Glenn. You probably know, in fact, I know you know Linda's older brother, John Falcone.
Oh, sure.
So, yeah, so Linda's also a Lafayette grad. I think she arrived after you left. All right, Constance had a question. Any thoughts regarding potential lab origin of the virus in light of the fact that variants are more contagious, more deadly, rather than weakening?
No. I don't think so. I think an investigation is worthwhile because it might tell us something about the safety of scientific research and maybe the origins of this virus. There are telltale marks within the genetics of a genetically modified anything, bacteria, virus, that should have been obvious. We sequenced this virus within the first months of it coming out. So if this thing had been mutated or genetically engineered in a laboratory, rather than something that passed from, bat to human, which is the current supposition, I would have thought we would have known about this months and months ago. I actually am not going to opine on this because I don't know. I'm aware of some of the concerns that there were individuals who worked in this virology laboratory in Wuhan that had, sort of serious disease that looked a little bit like COVID back in November. Some of this stuff might be true and unrelated, similar to what I'd said before. But I don't know. And so therefore, I think probably for me to talk more about it is, I'll be interested to see what happens with it. That's for sure. Now we have a question from fellow 85 Bob Parsons, who said, terrific presentation. He said, just curious, I think this is a Nostradamus moment for you. Just curious, any predictions on the percentage of Americans that will eventually get vaccinated? $75. And the reason I say that is because there were a lot of people, so we're right around 51, 52, and I'm splitting the difference between 50 and 100 and going with 75. I think there were a lot of people who said, you get the vaccine. And when you don't grow a second head, or when your toes don't turn green and fall off, then maybe I'll consider it. We've had hundreds of millions of individuals get these vaccines, and virtually all of them are not only fine, their second head did not grow and their toes didn't fall off, but they're also fully protected against this infection. And they're getting licensed to do things like go back to stores without masks or return to the theater. I'm a big jazz fan. I want to go back to jazz clubs. I miss this very much. So I think when some group of those that have been hesitant to get vaccines begins to realize that there isn't danger, that the water is warm, and that there is a sense of reassurance once you've been vaccinated, I suspect the rates are going to continue to increase. But I think that there's also 25% or so of us that just is like, nope, don't need it, don't care. And as I've said, that is not my decision, but it's their prerogative to make.
So I think that's all the questions that we had in the chat, and people do have the ability to unmute themselves if anybody either wants to go on mic and ask a question or put anything in the chat. Otherwise, if there's any sort of parting comments from you, Glenn. Oh, wait, let's see. Here we go. Parent of an 8-year-old here, how would you feel about sending elementary kids back to school in the fall before they're eligible to be vaccinated if masking is no longer mandatory? That's from Susie.
I think a little bit of it depends upon how well vaccinated your community is and what kinds of precautions the school is putting in place. What are the restrictions about distancing, about vaccination requirements for teachers, about airflow, because that makes a big difference as well. We know that this vaccine does not spread efficiently outside because when you sneeze and you produce an aerosol, outside it dissipates. In a closed, stuffy room, like some classrooms are, those viruses can kind of hang like a cloud in the air. So I think, and please feel free to write to me because we can have a little back and forth about this. I certainly understand the anxiety on the part of some parents to let their kids back. And I promise you, I am not a champion of the idea that, well, kids get infected less, and when they get infected, it's less serious. Well, no, actually, we've had 500 kids in the United States who've died of COVID, and we've had a fair number of them who have gotten infected. Yes, thankfully, a silver lining is the kids seem to be less susceptible to infection, and when they get infected, they seem to be less impacted by disease. But I don't think that's a game of risk that I would be necessarily willing to play. At the same time, I think, again, come back to my Senor Salsa argument. There is value for kids to be in schools with their friends, with teachers. There is value, especially depending on the age of that kid, for corporate kinds of learning. So you're not going to have an obvious answer. There are going to be risks on both sides, not just risks with sending your kid to school, potentially risks of not sending your kid to school. So I acknowledge that it's a wrenching decision and that it can be a challenging one. But I think, especially if those vaccines open up to kids as they have down to 12 so far, that's going to help shape this discussion substantially. I have a feeling that virtual will still be an option for different parts of the country through the fall. I have a feeling most kids will return in person, but those kids or parents that don't want their kids to go will still have the ability to do that. That might change in the winter, spring semester.
And you're getting some love in the chat, but I don't have any more questions here. So
I see the chat. Thank you for the love.
Well, I'll send you the list of all those things, Glenn. Any final comments to folks before we close it up?
No, I really appreciate you listening. I sincerely do. I mean, some of you might be like, let's see what Rall looks like after 25 years. It hasn't gone very well. But I do appreciate you guys tuning in and spending an hour with me. It feels validating, and I sincerely appreciate it. So I look forward to seeing you guys at a future in-person reunion.
Well, we thank you so much, Glenn, and for taking the time tonight, and for someone that never took any biology classes at Lafayette. If they had been equated to salsa, maybe I would have taken a few.
Sure.
So again, it really so informative, and thank you so much on behalf of all of our attendees and really on behalf of the Alumni Relations Office. And thank you to all of you for joining this evening. And this is just the beginning of a virtual week of all sorts of programs. So check out the schedule on reunion.lafayette.edu. Join the app. We're sending out daily emails. So much great stuff to engage in and connect with classmates, and great content. So thank you all for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn.
No worries. Good night, everyone.
Take care, Glenn.